a very surprising source of fairly decent literature out there that falls under this genre that I never would have suspected could be so enlightening. And
hi everyone, welcome back. Today we'll be talking about a surprising source of values and where to find them. Because in today's society, as we've been talking about for most of this year so far, there are a lot of crazy things going on in Western culture and society at the moment, and they've been going on for several years, the last 5 at least, but with trends tracing back even before then. And it seems like there aren't very many sources to go to for either an affirmation of existing values or even to introduce those values. There is almost a concerted effort. Well, I think there's a concerted effort on behalf of several groups, individuals, ideologies to actually destroy the existing value structure of any existing society in which these people can be found. And that seems to be what's playing out. And you can see just symptoms of this, if not actual, if not that actual intention in practice in things like Hollywood or TV. And I think there is a lot of deliberate stuff that goes on, I think, in the writing of pop culture. But I think a lot of it, too, is just downstream of that ideology and what's going on kind of on another level. Just like philosophical ideas filter down into the way what people actually think and how they behave, I think a similar sort of thing goes on in Hollywood. So when you look at the trends in TV and in movies for the past several years, we can see a few things, one of which we've talked about before. I think we talked about it in our shows on Ertuğrul, the Turkish TV series, is in Western TV, there's a trend to what we called then, I think, like hyper-realism, in the sense of showing human nature at its worst, and usually without much, if any, redemptive qualities to it. So you'll see people behaving badly, essentially, and it pretty much gets left at that. So an example of that is a show like Game of Thrones. But not the only one. You can see it. I mean, what we were thinking of a list like Game of Thrones, Westworld, even The Wire, and there are some really good shows. But there are some really, well, even in that show when we were talking about it, we said there are things to be gleaned and learned from dark subject matter or a representation of humanity at its worst. But when that's all you have, then you're missing something. It's like growing up without fairy tales or kids' stories and just watching like mindless cartoons that don't necessarily model and instill any kind of values. Mm-hmm. And so what we see that played out in behavior, I think, and in the way that people just live in the world and the way they act, that if they have no source of these values, then they're not going to act them out to any great degree in their ordinary lives. So where do I want to go from there? We talked about a show like Ertuğrul, which does present certain values and ideals that are lacking in Western shows. And then, okay, now here's what I want to do. So whenever there is a source of that in English-speaking culture, it gets shot down. It's almost like it can't exist. And we see this in cancel culture, for instance, and the types of people and organizations and institutions that get canceled. So it's not just far-right ideologies or people or groups for right now that are victim of that, of getting canceled. It is pretty much anything traditional, anything. It could be just mainstream Christianity, any kind of like church organization. Well, any kind of Western church organization, and this all comes back to critical race theory and its family of ideologies, critical theories. So wokeness, in a sense, social justice. So anyone espousing a kind of traditional value, that is, there's no value to that. There's no value to traditional values because the express purpose of wokeness and of social justice ideology is to destroy Western civilization as we know it. Everything that, the entire value structure, all of the institutions, the express goal is to destroy them and remake them in the image of wokeness, in the image of social justice. And some people think that's a good thing, but of course I don't think very many people actually do, but some do, and they've made it their goal to achieve that. So when you have any kind of symptom or sign of a traditional structure like that, a traditional belief or worldview, then it is written off as somehow part of the oppressive structure of Western society. And that will be labeled as racist, sexist, transphobic, etc. All the isms and obics out there, phobics, that's the label that will be applied to them. So it gets to ridiculous, it approaches ridiculous limits. For instance, when you have the Dr. Seuss family or the estate, and they're publishing, saying they're going to remove 6 of Dr. Seuss's books for, questionable racial representations within them. What are some other ones? So we've had Dr. Seuss get canceled. What other ones come to mind?
I wasn't thinking so much in terms of literature as the kind of movement towards giving boys who display toxic masculinity the correct education, so-called instruction via schools to kind of drum out the propensities, the behaviors, the actions, the thoughts that make young men and boys, or rather make this kind of natural process of what is sometimes considered bad behavior a moral wrong. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, of course you're going to have, any one of us here, I'm sure, knew some bad kids who displayed overly aggressive behavior and were basically assholes and treated people terribly and were maladjusted and socially kind of antisocial. And obviously, there is something to be said for addressing serious cases. But when you lump in,
but that's not toxic masculinity, like, per se. It's not that is right. Like masculinity and toxic. You don't need this special word to identify what was wrong at the time. That's misidentifying what the problem is. The real issue was the pathology of the individuals in question. It wasn't some like toxic masculinity or whatever. But
you could say it started out. There's a progression of terms. So you've just got masculinity, then we get this idea of toxic masculinity, which seems to be addressing a subset of typically masculine behaviors, which there is some empirical truth to. For instance, pretty much all serious violent crime, rape and murder, is committed by men, a small percentage of men. So you could make a case that behaviors like that could be called toxic masculinity because there's masculinity, which is the vast majority of men, and then there's a toxic variety of a single-digit percentage of men that engage in activities like that, crimes like that. So you can say that's toxic. You can say that's toxic masculinity, but what you then have is, so you've got masculinity that gets, and then you've got toxic masculinity, which is a tiny subset of the first category. But what you have now is that subset is now being applied to all masculinity. Right. So any display
or
manifestation of actual masculinity then gets called toxic masculinity.
Mm-hmm.
So, and even that will approach ridiculous proportions. So just like you have Dr. Seuss getting blacklisted, certain books, like, it's ridiculous. It doesn't need to happen.
Right.
It's not like Dr. Seuss is ruining any lives with some of his kids' stories, but you also get something like something analogous that plays out in actual life. One example of which is the whole idea of rape culture, for instance. That's another thing. It's the same process that is played out, where you have that small percentage of men and some women, but a smaller percentage of women who rape people, and then that gets inflated into this idea of a rape culture, where rape is endemic, and pretty much everyone is engaging in it. And the definitions actually change. So if you look at how some social justice ideologues have defined rape, pretty much any sexual encounter can be defined as rape, so that all men then are now rapists. And Heather MacDonald has talks about this in a really good book. I got the book and I read it because Jordan Peterson recommended it, and I'm glad that I did, just because it's a really good book, The Diversity Delusion. She has several chapters in which she talks about this whole phenomenon and just how ridiculous it is. And when you actually look at these cases where things that basically, in this specific example of rape culture, what it comes down to is that several things which in no way could be or should be defined as rape are getting classified as rape.
Mm-hmm.
And that, it's just a whole world of crazy, to the point where in a lot of American universities, and not just universities, just you can find it in articles in like online outlets and newspapers, calling for like standards of consent, for instance, where because the way they've defined consent and rape and anything sexual, then verbal explicit consent is required for basically every stage of a sexual encounter. And it is...
And not just each new stage of the encounter, but every continuous,
Yes.
Continuation of an already
Right.
established...
Is this still okay? Do
Yep.
I still have your consent? It's like... so they take something where there's a kernel of truth to it, just like with toxic masculinity, and the fact that, yes, at some point, especially in college campuses, and like, feelings can change even in the moment. It's like if someone says, no, I'm not okay with this at that point, well, that's a pretty explicit statement of, this is not okay. But that doesn't change that to the point where if either partner doesn't say anything and seems to be enjoying a sexual encounter, then the fact that they didn't say anything, the fact that neither says anything and each goes along with it, and even if they're texting each other afterwards saying, oh, what a great time they had, that either one of those two people could be a rapist, according to the way they define these things. That's what I'm talking about. How that's what I mean when I say that it approaches these ridiculous dimensions, these absurd dimensions, to the point where it's like you're living in a bizarro world, because some of these cases are exactly like that, where two people will have, and they're not even blackout drunk, which a lot of these cases have to do with, which is a tricky case, and there's, it's a whole other story, but two consenting adults, young adults, and even in a relationship with multiple sexual encounters and sexual interactions, where at some point in the future, one of those two people will then decide, oh, well, actually, no, I changed my mind now, so my consent that was given at that point is no longer valid. So it's like a retroactive reversal of consent. And then the way that the university tribunals are set up, the accused isn't allowed access to a lawyer or access to the evidence or the ability to defend themselves, to actually, like, in that tribunal. So it's pretty much a kangaroo court. And there are a lot of issues, like legitimate issues, I think, when it comes to sexuality in particular, and especially on college campuses, that have implications and ramifications for all kinds of other things, not just limited to university and like college campus culture, everything from childhood and wider society. But regardless of that, there's things have gotten so polarized to the point where it's like you can imagine the most toxic situation,
Mm-hmm.
and the problems involved in that, and it's kind of, things have spiraled to like the total opposite of a toxic situation, but treating it as if it's even as bad or worse than those toxic examples.
Yeah, and just to be clear, I've personally known women who were date raped and abused, and it happens, and maybe it even happens at a level of frequency that isn't reported. That's possible too. What we're talking about here, what we're zeroing in on, I think, is the idea that all or a very broad eye is being leveled at sexuality and what is very conventional male behavior in many cases that isn't necessarily aggressive, and that's up for debate too, I suppose. But there's this. This is all part of there. There are so many different ways in which there is a kind of subjective, arbitrary, new set of criteria that's being foisted upon people, where the role models of correct and appropriate behavior and thinking and being are being kind of withdrawn and pulled right out from under many individuals. And it's got to be a very confusing time right now to grow up as a teenager or even a person in their early 20s, mm-hmm. because what we're getting at, and I think what we'd like to discuss here today, is the lack of healthy role models that we're not seeing and aren't being necessarily represented by our parents or even our teachers, or I should say our teachers or even our parents. And we want to discuss, I think, where role models might be found.
Well, not just role models, but an actual value system. Because I know Heather McDonald, the way she explains it, she tells the story. And I think she's got a point. I think I might even agree with her, like in the broad strokes, is that what happened in American society, American culture, was in the 60s you had the like sexual revolution, not just the sexual revolution, but a whole consciousness revolution, is I think how the Fourth Turning guys put it. But you had a total restructuring of, in this specific case, sexual norms. So on university campuses, for instance, you had strict like sexual segregation. So you couldn't have. So this would be in like the 50s and beforehand. You didn't have co-ed campuses or co-ed dorms or anything like that, and you still had the idea of chaperones and the idea that for men and women, the idea was that society was basically structured on the idea that it was obvious that men wanted sex, and it was obvious that women would withhold sex, and that you basically had to court a woman. The man had to court the woman, date her, and probably get married in most cases, or in a lot of cases, in order to establish that relationship, and then for those sexual energies to then, have a means of being expressed, essentially. And that got totally turned upside down, because that was, from the feminist perspective, that was treating women like children, that they needed it was the male's responsibility to protect them and to basically coddle them in some sense. And it was like, no, we want freedom. We want the freedom to be able to walk on the street on our own. And then has got to the point of we want the freedom to basically, well, what it became was what we have now, which is just a sexual free-for-all of casual sex, and those previous norms are no longer around, where it's like there's no impediment to that sexual relationship. So you have this hookup culture, and what has happened is that it has created the call for a new type of Puritanism, puritanical approach to gender relations, where now there's a strict policing of the sexual lives of college students. They're basically asking for it. This is what you see with these like rape tribunals and things like that, where it's now society's role to protect women from the sexual advances of men. But it's in this, there's this contradiction in the sense that it's totally like a free license, like free-for-all, like a sexual free-for-all. And on the other hand, sexuality needs to be tightly regulated because it's so out of control and bad.
Well, it's cognitive dissonance inducing is what it is.
Yeah.
Which gets back to my point about this being a very confusing time, I think, because by the same token, you also have this other development of what some call simps, or very very weak males who adore females to a kind of almost just an unhealthy degree. There's no agency on the part of the male. There is no there's nothing about the male as a male that's integrated or individuated or knows what he is, aside from being this kind of adjunct, or I don't even know how to describe this, but it does seem like a very real development among a lot of males in Western culture right now.
There was a study that came out, I think, a year or two ago, where they were looking at the number of male virgins under the age of, I want to say it was 30. And they had statistics going back like 30 years or more, quite a large amount of data to be able to look at, the trend of, how young men are, or how many young men are sexually active at, certain points at young ages. And it was within the past, I think it was starting in 2017, 2016, where you had like the number of male virgins at, I think 20, I think by the age of 20, there was like only 10% of male virgins up until that point. And then all of a sudden it shot up to 27%. So there was this large increase in the number of men who were avoiding having a intimate relationship with anyone, which I think indicates something. We can debate whether, what exactly was the cause of it, but I think we've kind of hashed out a couple of possible reasons. But yeah, I think it does indicate that, what you were talking about, Alon, that there is something going on that is creating a disturbance or an impediment to the natural, healthy engagement of the sexes, I guess you could say.
There's a couple things on that. I'm reading Abigail Schreier's book, Irreversible Harm. One of the things she points out there is that I'm pretty sure it was the majority, something like, it might have been 70% of the young girls who who identify as transgender and who, use things like, what are those binders, to flatten their breasts and to take testosterone treatments. I'm pretty sure it was 70% of them. That might be another figure. I'd have to double check. Have never had a relationship before, either with a boy or a girl. So they've never had a boyfriend or a girlfriend. And in the context of some other things that Schreier was talking about, that makes sense, because a lot of these girls, it seems, I think it was 70% of girls, 70% of transgender cases are girls in this age range, whereas it used to be that there were no girls and it was all young boys, like prepubescent boys who had gender dysphoria. But it was still a large percentage of these girls have never had a relationship, and part of what that has to do with is that usually happens after puberty, this rapid onset gender dysphoria, and a lot of these girls are really uncomfortable with their bodies, and it seems that the transgender ideology is a way of gives them an outlet, not only for self-harm, but because there is this weird almost masochism that goes along with it, where that's just one issue, where the pain involved in either testosterone shots or wearing binders, it's almost ecstatic. And a lot of these girls were engaging in self-harm either before or during when they actually transition. And so there's the harm aspect to it, but what did I say? That it's like an outlet. So by identifying now as a boy, these girls no longer have to feel uncomfortable that their female bodies don't live up to whatever the female standard is.
Mm-hmm.
And this all has to do, there's so many things going on here, a big one of which is social media. This is one of the things that Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff talk about in Coddling of the American Mind, is that social media is terrible, especially for young girls, because young girls, the way that aggression comes out in young girls, it is mostly verbal, and it's gossiping, and it's talking about the way other girls look. And then when you're on social media, there's the competition to put up your selfies and things like that, and then you get exposed to immediate and permanent, because it's always there, criticism of your looks. So this has contributed to just skyrocketing rates of depression and anxiety in teenage girls. And so you put all that stuff together and more that I haven't even mentioned, and it's not a good time to be a teenager. So just those few things that we've mentioned, it's just the toxic effects of social media, the lack of actual physical contact with other people, because it used to be that girls and boys, they hung out together at each other's houses, on the streets, in shopping malls. Now the vast majority of interactions are online. Kids don't hang out with each other anymore. They don't have someone to just commiserate with when something bad happens, and you don't have a small group of friends that you can actually talk to in person. Everything is depersonalized and limited to these artificial digital interactions. And so you have kids who aren't interacting with the other sex in a way that has been more or less normal for the entire history of humanity before all these new technologies have come on board. Even if the forms of interaction have changed and are different in cultures and there's different things going on, there was still at least physical interaction and social engagement. So, but now there's this depersonalization, there's the skyrocketing mental illness, and which has contributed to this the kind of the epidemic of gender dysphoria and the lack of interaction with the opposite sex, combined with, when everyone goes to college, this totally backwards system of courtship. It's not even a system of courtship. It's just, I don't even know what it is. And so there are pretty much wherever you look, you can just like close your eyes and randomly throw the dart at the dartboard and find something wrong, something weird, something strange, weird, wrong, pathological. It's just a mess and a maze of weirdness. And during all of this, as we mentioned a bit earlier, to then bring in an actual value system that has been, let's say, tried and tested, a traditional value system, which may be flawed. We can get into that. At least it works. That is then written off like paramoralistically, in the sense that to then try to introduce a moral framework, a traditional moral framework, one of any number of traditional moral frameworks, you're then the evil person, because that is that all traditional systems that are, let's say, live options for anyone living in at least an English-speaking world, in the English-speaking world today, any of those previously live options are systems of white supremacy and the patriarchy, etc. Like, you know, they are all evil. So you can't even bring in an alternative, because all the alternatives are actually morally repugnant according to this ideology. And so what options are you left with? Well, in mainstream, like, public culture, you can't get away with anything. If you are, let's say, a traditional, if you're a Christian, or just religious to any degree, if you're a conservative religious person in any religious tradition, you can be vocal about it, but you won't be. To be vocal about it is to expose yourself to the wrath of the online mad dogs of social justice.
Mm-hmm.
So where do you look? Well, so I started out by saying there's actually an interesting source, an underground stream of hidden knowledge and and traditional values. So this is interesting. So in this climate, where anything traditional is like publicly rebuked as evil and patriarchal and bigoted and xenophobic and sexist and whatever, there's still a lot of romance novels that are getting sold and read primarily by women. So this was very interesting. So we've been experimenting and reading romance novels to see what's going on there. Now, there are a whole lot of types of romance novels, right? I remember I had never read any romance novels. Like, I enjoy a romantic comedy every once in a while, and especially like a period piece, like BBC, whenever they're some of their productions of, you know, some of the classics. I've enjoyed those. And I remember a talk that Jordan Peterson gave where he just, you know, was just throwing out something, you know, throwing out facts here and there. And he was talking about like men and women, and like the types of pornography that men and women prefer. And that for men, of course, it's visual pornography, but women prefer actually reading, like an actual story. And he was talking about the top selling female, top like sexual object archetypes that appear in stories for women like this, and they were like the vampires and like pirates or whatever they were, like, so these kind of cheesy like stereotypes, yeah. But there is nestled within the romance world, there's at least one, I don't know, there might be more, but I'm not familiar with them, but there's a genre in the romance, the wider romance genre, that's called regency romance. So it's basically just romance novels set in the Regency period, in like the early 1800s, like Napoleonic War era, and it's just essentially romance stories told in that period. There's a whole bunch of authors, but the one that we're going to talk about is a Welsh Canadian named Mary Balog, who's quite prolific, has written like 93 or something novels in her career, which is, I think she's been writing for 35 years. So that's like almost an average of 3 novels a year. And she's actually really good. And so just to sum up my point, and then I'll get you guys to carry on, that within this this situation we have, where there's not only, I'd say, like a lack of a value system, presented in a positive light, kind of like why we found Ertugrul to be such a relief, like finding water in the desert. That within this world, the Western world, amid all of the like Twilight and
50 Shades of
Grey, and it's and like related themes and topics, you've got this this stream of very popular romance novels. And maybe this is what we can actually do now, is talk about what they actually portray, but which have so far escaped cancel culture. Like, I haven't seen any articles in like Huffington Post or wherever, or BuzzFeed, or any of these outlets who regularly engage in this type of behavior. I haven't seen anyone calling out this type of romance, and so I hope that we don't unintentionally become responsible for.
Well, I think there's a good reason for that, and I think it's also the reason why, I've never read any of this genre of novel before, and that is in part because of how they're marketed, with the silly covers and the
Fabio covers,
the Fabio covers, and the models, and these sweepingly romantic poses with impossibly beautiful men and women who are in an embrace, and so there's a tendency, at least there was in my part, to dismiss the entire genre as quite silly. Mm-hmm. And to my mind, this was something that frumpy, mature women read as an outlet, and at the end of the novel, if it was half good, they cried, and they were silly women. And anyone who would read this type of material must therefore be a silly person. So that's what I brought to the table in starting to read some of these novels. And much to my surprise, the covers of a lot of these novels are fairly misleading. Because even if it isn't on the literary level of a Charles Dickens or a Dostoevsky or Jane Austen, there are still elements to these books, values, character development, that is being very articulately conveyed in the thought processes of the protagonists who are getting together. And what we're talking about, I know, is the development of the men and the women that these books discuss. And yes, you do have a smattering of sexually explicit scenes where the passions are conveyed, the sensations are described, the attraction is fleshed out, no pun intended. But this is in the best of these novels, and we've been fortunate enough to read a few. It's organic. It is part of the emotional life of the individuals involved, and even how, in fact, they process these feelings for one another, where there is a tension between the heart and the mind, so to speak, that gets resolved or in the process of being resolved. And it's in that process that these characters learn something, and I think we as the reader get to learn something as well, especially when we're able to identify to some greater or lesser degree with the characters who are acting out of their wounds, acting out of their past traumas, their programs. So a very surprising source of fairly decent literature out there that falls under this genre that I never would have suspected could be so enlightening in some ways.
There was, at the start of the show, I just, was writing some stuff down, and it kind of came to me of what, an interesting contrast. And I wrote down an unexpected place to find virtuous ideals. And why I think that's kind of funny is because I never thought of reading romance novels or just romance novels in general as being a virtuous thing, if that makes sense, because it always seemed to me, at least from my religious upbringing, to be something that was, on the level of pornography. And its moral, on a moral dimension, it, is somewhat repugnant because of its pornographic details of intimate relations. So I, coming back and looking at it now, it's just kind of funny that I see it as being virtuous because it does have a lot of virtuous people. Just from the standpoint of, like you were saying, Alon, the growth and the development of individual characters is just fantastic. Character growth, character development. That's one thing that I like, because I'd never read any of these novels before either. So I had no idea what I was getting into. And then you get into it and you're like, holy crap, this is good. Yeah. This is really good. Like, call me an old woman, but geez. It takes you through the process of having, putting yourself into the shoes of the characters and feeling how they feel of their past wounds and their hurts and then going through the process with them of overcoming them, of finding the courage and the strength to overcome their previous, roadblocks with the help of, their newly found love interests, which can be kind of silly at times, but on the whole, it's fantastic. And so talking about it in terms of, why it's been so good, or why I think they are so good, I wanted to bring up a passage from one of Balog's books. It is Someone to Love, which is the first book of the Westcott series. And there is the female protagonist, Anna, who is a school teacher at an orphanage. And she was talking to one of her, one of her colleagues, and this colleague was talking about how it's amazing that she's able to get kids engaged in learning and excited to learn by by getting them involved in this telling of stories. And so I wanted to read this little bit, and this starts off with Joel, her colleague. Your pupils, he said, are going to realize when they grow up that they have been horribly tricked. They will have all these marvelous stories rolling around in their heads, only to discover that they are not fiction at all, but that driest of all realities, history, and geography, and even arithmetic. You get your characters, both human and animal, into the most alarming predicaments from which you can extricate them only with a manipulation of numbers and the help of your pupils. They do not even realize they are learning. You are a sly, devious creature, Anna. Have you noticed, and this is Anna responding, straightening the counting frames to her liking before closing the cupboard doors and turning toward him, that at church, when the clergyman is giving his sermon, everyone's eyes glaze over, and many people even nod off to sleep. That was me.
Me too.
But if he suddenly decides to illustrate a point with a little story, everyone perks up and listens. We were made to tell and listen to stories, Joel. It is how knowledge was passed from person to person and generation to generation before there was the written word, and even afterward, when most people had no access to manuscripts or books and could not read them even if they did. Why do we now feel that storytelling should be confined to fiction and fantasy? Can we enjoy only what has no basis in fact? And so that was, I think, a great illustration of why this is so good for people, and why I would highly recommend it to everyone to read this, specific subset. This is genre of romance, because of the not only the portrayal of ideals, but also the emotional insights that the authors have. And Balog she's how many PhDs does she have? Because she's got to have like 18 in terms of her understanding of psychology. But you have that you get that, you learn it, the emotional, what is the word? The emotional
intelligence.
Yes, you get to increase your emotional intelligence and your ability to understand not only how these characters feel, but also how you feel. And this has been an interesting thing for me, is because I've, being, a male and having gone through, my life as I did, I had blocked off a lot of emotions and a lot of repressed emotions, and learning how these characters, or going through the different processes with a number of these different books, I'm able to realize, like, oh, that's what I've been feeling, or that's what I was feeling at, this previous time in my life. And so I'm able to resolve it. It's no longer stuck there at the back of my mind, just eating away at me, doing whatever it's doing.
And it's not only you, Adam. It's not only you. I mean, what these books show is that these kinds of issues are very common to many people. We just don't know that they are. We think that we're somehow special, or we have the most damaged award, or there's some something extraordinarily wrong, maybe about one thing or another that makes us uniquely wrong for relationships. When the relationship it's the process of the relationship. It's not this fixed thing, especially at the beginning. And that's really how a lot of these stories are structured. It's about the two characters getting together. It's about all of the things that they have to work on resolving within themselves and their potential partners that would bring them forward and actually become something even greater as a result. Because there's in many of these stories, not Balog's in particular, there's this kind of manifestation of their bond that takes the form of fighting the baddie, the representation of the kind of pathological male that is presented in the narrative to create a contrast with the protagonist, who may have some issues, but is basically someone who has a good heart and good intelligence and wants to do the right thing and is striving throughout the story to do the right thing despite his shortcomings.
And that is that reminds me that there is it's not a tropish or just kind of bland and expected kind of like storyline. Like, they're all pretty interesting.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing is that nobody's really unidimensional. And that's another thing that I really like about this genre, is that the women are women and the men are men, and not some caricature of what men ought to be, which is one thing that I was kind of half expecting when I started this, was that the men would be just this caricature of what masculine is, or what to be a male is, and it's not.
Yeah. Well, what that might be, it's kind of like it's kind of like conservatives and liberals. One of the interesting things I learned when reading Jonathan Haidt was that liberals do not understand conservatives. And when they're asked to give a representation of what they think conservatives actually believe, they get it wrong. Like, they can't do it. But conservatives have a very good idea and a very good understanding of how liberals think and what liberals believe. And that has to do with their moral taste buds, as Haidt puts it. And it seems to be, maybe that's something about female and male authors, is that it turns out that, there's all the jokes about men not understanding women, which I think are totally true, but women really do understand men. And so these authors, because all of the authors that I've encountered that I've seen are women. I'm not familiar with any male author that writes at least Regency romance. There might be some, and maybe if they do exist, they use a female nom de plume, but it's all women writers, and they've got a pretty good idea of what's going on.
Well, I got to tell you, I mean, more than once I'm reading this and I would be like, how the hell do they know that?
Yeah.
And in a variety of situations as well. It's like, wait a minute. This is one author with an imagination, right? Maybe she's had some life experience. I'll grant her that. Maybe she wasn't married for 10 or 20 years. But there's a kind of a spectrum of insights into, male thinking that is...
First rule of Male Club, you don't talk about Male Club.
Yeah, it's not uncomfortable because it's respectful.
Mm-hmm.
She's honoring, this is what it is, I think, in part, anyway. She's honoring what natural male and female behavior and thinking and attraction looks like, and what it is. Basically, it's dealing with what is. It's not pathologizing or twisting or changing into some kind of ideological perception of what normal male and female thinking is, or average male and female thinking. So it strikes home. And it's a resource. That's what I would say about all of this. It is a real resource. You could read drier books about psychology, and you'll gain some knowledge. You can go to therapy, and you can gain some knowledge. You can discuss issues with intimates, with people you trust, and you can gain some knowledge. You can also read these books in the privacy of your home and enjoy them. They're very entertaining, and you will gain some knowledge.
I want to talk about a couple things, and one is this element of what I think you could call catharsis. It's not just a matter of identifying with a character and, let's say, saying, "Oh, I see myself in that," or something like that. There is that, but it is, I think it was like you were saying, Ilan, it's the process. There is a formula to these novels, right? But within that formula, there's endless variation, so it never gets boring. The formula is essentially man meets woman, conflict, resolution, and getting married. It's pretty much how they all play out. But of course, that's the story of humanity. And look at how many humans there are and have been. So you've got a lot of variety within that formula. But it is the process that plays out. On Mary Balog's website, she recently had a blog post about how she writes and what goes into her writing process. And I didn't read it in the last few days, so I'm just going on memory here. But she basically writes about how she, like, what happens in these novels and how she writes these characters. And just like a lot of authors, she says that she doesn't know where her ideas come from. They just come to her, and the characters exist. It's like she shapes them and forms them, but they often tell her how the story is going to proceed. So she might have an idea that it's going to go one way, but as the scene and that plays out, things change and they reveal something to her, and it's like, and she's trying to figure these characters out too. And of course, with a goal in mind, the goal will be to work something out, in the self and with the partner, to come to that resolution. And that means that there's going to have to be an element of personal transformation that goes on both sides. So as you're reading this and as you're identifying with the character, there's something actually going on in your mind where you are actively identifying with this character. It's like a form of learning, like children learning by mimicking, and like when an adult will do something, the child will do it with them, and that's one form of how children learn. But it's also just how the mind works, I think. So as you're experiencing these things with the characters, especially if it's a character that you can identify with for particular like similarities between your positions and your psychology, then you're actually your emotional nature is essentially working out those problems, working out those processes with the character. And so the catharsis is the experience of that, is the experience within oneself of what the character themselves is experiencing. Mm-hmm. So a part of you is actually transforming as the character transforms, if you can get into the story. So there's more going on than just reading a nice story, like you were saying, Adam, and reading a nice story and then crying and then that's a nice one. There's actually something more going on to it. And I want to talk a bit more about the kind of the formula, because this ties in with how we started the discussion about the current value system in Western culture. Because these stories all take place, like they're all regency romances, so they all take place within the value system of the regency period, which can be quite strange and funny on its own. And the way that the stories play out is often there's this social, like, moral framework in which this element of society lives, right? There are their social norms, the way they have to interact, the way they're expected to interact, and the things they're expected to do. Now, most of these stories are a woman and or a man bucking the trend in some way. So going against the expectations of society, oftentimes the social structure is this oppressive force. So, for example, even though all the stories are about relationships that end up being loving relationships, within the stories, the norm is that doesn't happen. That most people don't marry for love, for instance. So you get this view of the way that a society works and its social norms, which can be like more or less accurate. It doesn't really matter for the purpose of the story. This is you can forget that this is like based in reality in any way. That's kind of irrelevant. It's another world in a sense, even though it's part of English speaking history, but it's like 200 years it's 200 years old. It's like that society doesn't exist any longer. So for all intents and purposes, it might as well be just a fictional world to some degree. But you have these social norms and expectations. And then it's the characters, and that's part of the conflict. It's the characters' role in these stories to then navigate that world. So to navigate like the scandals that they might find themselves embroiled in, and the expectations on them that they might expect of themselves, and then to transcend those expectations to some degree, or to if not transcend, then to like fit them in. How will we negotiate these social expectations and the family expectations with what's actually going on? What can be resolved with others? What can be made to work, and what can't be? So oftentimes the conflict will be like one of the tropes is that a man and a woman get caught in a compromising situation, or one or the other intentionally puts the other in a compromising situation, and then they have to get married, because to not get married will then subject the woman to social stigma, and her life will be ruined. Her character and her reputation will be ruined. So it's the man's job to then step in and ask for her hand in marriage to save her from the social stigma associated with being loose or something like that. And so that's just one of the tropes, one of the formulas within the formula of how these stories might work. And I want to read, like, I've got a passage too from one of her older books. So this is from the Gilded Web. I think it was 89 or 1990 that it was first published in. So this is about two characters. The woman is Alexandra, and she grew up in a very kind of isolated environment with a strict like religious fundamentalist father, like just one of those how to describe them, a father like parents who are super strict, so no interacting with very many people. If you did something wrong, it's a mortal sin that you may have committed, and you have to get right with God. And so harsh punishments and strict unrealistic expectations. Very few signs of an actual loving relationship. So this woman has had this very sheltered and like abusive upbringing. Her brother too, and she gets put in one of these situations where she is then tied with this guy Edmund, and they have a pretty rocky like relationship for the majority of the story. And at one point, well, I'll just read a couple paragraphs, and this will give the idea of what's going on. So she says to him, "I was sickened by everyone's behavior last evening," she said in a low, rather hurried voice. "It was bad enough that they chose to judge me so harshly for something that was none of my own fault. For that alone, I would wish to have nothing more to do with society for the rest of my life. What was worse was the way almost everyone changed as soon as you hinted that we might become betrothed." So he essentially saved her by coming in and exactly as she said, hinting that they would be married, so that removed the potential stigma against her. "If last evening is an example of what gentility means, then I am ashamed of the name lady." So Edmund responds, "You are quite right in your judgment. Unfortunately, Miss Purnell, there is no perfect person on this planet, and certainly no perfect institution. Our society protects itself through its strict moral and social standards, and such high standards inevitably lead to corruption on the one hand, and to the type of hypocrisy of which you have been victim on the other. But perhaps it is possible to overreact. There are good, if not perfect, people in this world, and an institution can have its value even if it is flawed." So I thought that was not just good in the context of the story, because Alex herself has some stuff to work through, and because of her upbringing, that leads to almost a total rejection of this social structure that he's talking about. And him, as for Edmund, the social structure has, because he actually had a good family, it's actually provided him with the values that he lives by that are actually authentic for him, not a form of just like external
control,
not external control, and what's the word, virtue signaling, and just like status or anything like that. For him, he's actually internalized, so he's a good man, essentially. He's got his stuff to work through too. But so I think that's not only, like I said, it's not only good for the story, but it's a good understanding of a moral system, of any moral system, that like if you read Righteous Mind, you know what Jonathan Haidt says about morality. I mean, if you look at pretty much all moral systems, value systems that humans have developed, they're all crazy in one sense or another. But they all have this, at the same time, they all have their values, you know, go figure, that, which Jonathan Haidt relates to like heredity or like biology at the very root, that we all have these tendencies, these moral taste buds, fairness, liberty, you know, whatever. There's this 5 or 6 moral taste buds, sanctity, disgust, or purity. So there's these taste buds that then the value system takes a particular form, which can be vastly different from another social system, but they're approaching the same things. So you have this social system in this, or this value system in this case, in this regency thing. You have the system which serves a purpose, like Edmund is saying, and yet it will inevitably lead to corruption, just like all do.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where this like navigation comes in, where these characters have to kind of navigate their way through, because you can find characters in these books who are total villains or total hypocrites, who are totally shallow, who are controlled to some degree by the moral framework that they live in, and you can see the purpose that it serves, but you can also see how it that same system can then just target people, right? Can target a person like Alex, who, like she says, through no fault of her own, gets caught up in this situation where nothing essentially bad happens, but because of what it could mean, and because of the way it might look, that can be life ending, you know, to a certain degree, or reputation ending.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's this navigation of not only the all that potential bad stuff,
mm-hmm.
but to actually find within that system like a modus vivendi,
mm-hmm.
To actually live within it and to transcend it to some degree too.
Right.
So a lot of these characters they're not socially maladjusted. It's not like they're either like criminals or hermits or anything like that. They don't reject the world that they live in, but they manage to live within it. And I wouldn't even say it's a matter of compromise. It's more a matter of like just personal authenticity and integrity that these characters manage to have or to develop. And that's one of the things that stands out the most for me, is that these characters are they're actual characters, like they're actual individuals, and you have the kind of sociocentric like communal expectations that these characters have to then it is that external like moral structure that you do run up against, and that everyone runs up against, and then to actually find for oneself who you are, essentially, who you are and who you aren't. Like, what are the things that have, who is the person that you think you are, and that might have to do with the way you've been raised, the influence of your parents, the influence of this social structure, and then to find yourself within it, and then to just kind of to see and then become who you actually are, authentically for yourself. That's one of those. It's one of those aspects of these books that stands out for me, I'd say.
That there's, that's an interesting aspect of all of it. Is each character is a character. Mm-hmm. You know, sometimes the character can be really annoying and grating, and sometimes the characters are really funny. Just they are people, you know, real people, which is, you know, cool and interesting, and they, like us in our real lives, have to navigate the waters of society. You know, society, whatever society you live in, has certain expectations of you, and you have to, according to your own conscience, navigate, you know, what is right and what is wrong according to the situation that you're in. And so, yeah, you have the struggles of each character who has, you know, maybe they have a certain title, or, you know, they have a certain inheritance, or, you know, they have certain social expectations that they have to, you know, resolve with, you know, who they are and who they want to be, or what they used to want, and, you know, come to some resolution that ultimately they can not only live with, but live with a purpose. And I think that's just, you know, a great way of respecting, you know, the individual and the struggle of figuring out who you are and who you want to be, and how you go about finding that out. But that hints at the other aspect of a number of these authors, Mary Balogh in particular, where she doesn't just treat people with respect. She treats institutions with respect too. It's not just, you know, a caricature of you know, what the society that they have is. It's you know, it was meant to do something. It has a purpose. It's not just there to make your life miserable.
Right.
Even if, you know, your life is miserable because of it.
There's even something affirming in Courting Julia about her, Julia's, you know, this scheme that sets the story in motion with the, you know, deceased, was it the grandfather, the step-grandfather, who arranges for Julia to have to make a decision, a choice among her cousins who aren't biological cousins for a husband, which seems on the surface to be rather oppressive and controlling, but has this altogether different purpose and function and success that you can't see right away without the development of the story. I did want to get back to something you were saying a few minutes ago, Harrison, about this process of navigating, because, and how the kind of period piece in which a lot of these novels are set in is almost irrelevant, because what you're seeing is it's a kind of template for what successful work on oneself towards building a relationship may look like, at least in part. It's sort of the DNA, the building blocks, if you will, of this kind of work on oneself. And so, even though we live in a very different milieu and very different ideas about what's what right now, as we explained in the first third of the show, you know, there are these essential pieces that are being presented here that seem to be universal and timeless and basic and intrinsic, that we may benefit from, that we can look to as models, and consider. And there's something else too, and that is that, you know, I'm not only interested in how, when I'm reading these novels and stories, I'm not only thinking about how the protagonist is handling himself and what he's experiencing, but it is very interesting to get into the mind of the female as well, and to also kind of celebrate her growth in it too. I think that these stories work on a few different levels. I don't think it's only about, the guy and your identification with the guy per se. And speaking to the idea that these stories work on different levels, is the emotions that get brought up. The kind of, I think I described this to a few people. There is this kind of, that frumpy, mature woman who I imagined kind of getting emotional at the end of one of these novels. That's me,
I'm that emotional old woman.
That, in a sense, I mean, it's surprising. It's like, well, where did all that emotion come from? Where did all this feeling and, I guess that gets back to the idea that these books do have a cathartic effect, or in potential, that they work on a part of the nervous system, the mind, the heart, the however you want to describe it, that isn't as front and center or as easily recognized or described as we like to think, because we are in a very real sense strangers to ourselves, right? Not only in the cognitive biases we have and all the logical fallacies we indulge ourselves in, but also in matters of the heart and the spirit, if you will. So that, I think, is my one of my big takeaways.
Yeah. I think that we might just end it there. I'll just close by saying that I think that, relating this back to the first part of our discussion, that especially in reference to the young men we were talking about and the young women, basically having no idea who they are or who, the opposite sex is, that if young adults were to read novels like this, they, first of all, I think there's a type of willful ignorance on the part of men when it comes to understanding women, and specifically when it comes to putting the effort into to understand women. You see those memes and jokes, like the guy with the 10,000 page manual, and it's volume 1 of 30 of how to understand women, right? Well, it's funny, but most guys wouldn't even try to read volume 1. But if you read some of these stories, you might actually start to understand where women are coming from, and I guess if women read these, then they've already got, they like I said, maybe women have a better understanding of men than vice versa. But I think that at least a lot of these young girls too might learn something, and actually give them, because they're so lacking in just the very basics of life experience when it comes to just interacting with people, to actually read some stories that show real dynamics, both the painful ones and the ecstatic ones, that vicarious experience might actually give them some experience that is totally lacking in their lives, which is leading to these states of having no stable sense of self. And gender, sex is a big part of that. And that's why we've got this thing now that didn't exist 20 years ago, like gender fluidity. Gender fluidity is not a thing. This is at least as far as I'm concerned, a sign of a lack of a stable sense of self. And a lot of these young girls, especially, but young boys too, they don't know themselves. They haven't found themselves, and they're confused. And because of that confusion is then reinforced and reified. It's like that confusion and that lack of a sense of self that is then imputed on them. It's like that is your sense of self. Your lack of a sense of self is your sense of self, and it's a positive thing. Well, how about actually trying to find that sense of self? And one way to do it might be to read some romance novels. So, like we said, an unexpected source of underground knowledge, in a place that you wouldn't expect it. So if check out Mary Balog. If you're interested, you could always comment on the show, and we can maybe suggest some other authors too. But I mean, with 90-something novels, I think you can just check out some Mary Balog and see if you like it or not. And with that said, take care. Talk to you later.